The moment Captain Rourke pulled the trigger, he knew he had made a mistake. The alien lay motionless, its iridescent exoskeleton reflecting the dim emergency lights of the starship Peregrine *. The entire crew stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats. Then, the body twitched. A strange clicking sound filled the air, sharp, rhythmic, and utterly terrifying. "Ah, Captain," whispered Lieutenant Dawn. The noise grew louder, echoing through the narrow corridors. It wasn't coming from the dead alien. It was coming from outside the ship. Rourke's pulse spiked as he turned toward the viewport. The dark void of space was no longer empty. Hundreds, no, thousands, of gleaming shapes drifted into view, their exoskeletons catching the faint light of a distant star. "They saw," Dawn breathed. "They didn't just see," Chief Engineer Volka muttered. "They felt it." The Xendar were unlike any species humanity had encountered. Insectoid, lethal, and bound together by something deeper than telepathy, a shared consciousness so alien it defied understanding. The Peregrine had been sent to study them, to determine whether peaceful contact was possible. Now, thanks to a single, split-second decision, diplomacy was over. A deep vibration rumbled through the ship. The Xendar fleet had locked onto them. "Shields up," Rourke barked. "They're not firing," Dawn said, eyes flicking over the sensor readings. "They're waiting." Waiting for what? The answer came as the dead alien's body convulsed violently, then shattered apart in a burst of iridescent dust. The particles shimmered, rising in the air like living embers before darting toward the walls, the floors, the consoles, seeping into the ship itself. "Containment breach," Volka shouted. Rourke's hand shot to his communicator. "Quarantine all sections. Nobody moves without clearance." Too late. The dust-like particles moved with intelligence, vanishing into vents and circuitry, slipping through the very air they breathed. The ship groaned, the metal beneath their feet vibrating as if alive. "Them," Rourke finished grimly. He'd heard the rumors. The Xendar weren't just a species. They were a hive, a singular entity scattered across millions of bodies. Kill one, and the others knew *. They adapted *. And now, one had died aboard Peregrine *. "We have to get out of here," Volka said, her fingers flying over the controls. "If even one of those spores reaches a human colony." The ship shuddered. Lights flickered. A deep, crawling whisper filled the air. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the ship itself. "They're inside the systems," Dawn choked out. The whisper resolved into a voice. Cold, endless, not spoken in sound, but directly into their minds. "You killed one of us. Now we will take all of you." The ship's engines roared to life on their own. Course unknown. Destination, irrelevant. Peregrine no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the Xendar. Rourke drew his weapon. He had declared war. Now, he had to survive it. Point 1. Captain Rourke kills a Xendar, triggering an immediate reaction from the hive mind species. 2. A massive Xendar fleet arrives, watching but not attacking, yet. 3. The dead alien's body disintegrates into intelligent spores that invade the ship. 4. The Xendar take control of Peregrine's systems, turning it against the crew. 5. A chilling hive mind voice declares war, leaving the crew trapped and outmatched. Captain Rourke's finger tightened around the trigger. The air in the dimly lit corridor of the Peregrine was thick with tension, every crewmember frozen in place as they faced the alien figure before them. The Xendar stood motionless, its multi-jointed limbs folding and unfolding with eerie precision. Its iridescent exoskeleton shimmered under the emergency lights, colors shifting like oil on water. It had not attacked. It had not even moved aggressively. But it was in their path, and Rourke had made a choice. The shot rang out, the high-energy pulse slicing through the stale air and striking the alien's center mass. The force of the blast sent it staggering backward, its elongated arms twitching, its clawed feet scraping against the metal floor. A strange, keening sound reverberated through the corridor, high-pitched and unnatural. The Xendar collapsed, its body shuddering violently. For a moment, silence. Then, a ripple of unease spread through the gathered crew. Lieutenant Dawn took an unconscious step forward, his breath coming fast and shallow. Did it? Before he could finish, the Xendar convulsed again. The shifting hues of its exoskeleton flickered erratically, its segmented body jerking as though it were reacting to something unseen. Its mandibles clicked together in rapid succession, creating a sound that sent an involuntary shiver through everyone present. It wasn't dead. Not yet. Chief Engineer Volka adjusted the grip on her plasma cutter, her normally unshakable hands visibly tense. Captain, we need to contain this thing now. Rourke took a step forward, his weapon still aimed at the twitching alien. He had encountered hostile species before, had seen creatures that refused to die even when they should have. But this was different. The way the Xendar reacted, the way its body spasmed, it was as if it were trying to signal something. Then, the clicking sound changed. It became rhythmic, almost measured, repeating in an unnatural pattern. Don's fingers danced across his handheld scanner, his brow furrowing. Captain, he whispered, his voice tight with something dangerously close to fear. We've got a problem. Rourke didn't need to ask. He could see it in Don's expression. The scanner was picking up something. Something outside the ship. He turned toward the viewport at the end of the corridor. The stars beyond were quiet, the void stretching endlessly. But then he saw them. A glimmer. A shift in the darkness. Then, thousands of sleek, chitinous bodies drifting into view, their forms catching the faint light of a distant star. Their exoskeletons pulsed with the same eerie iridescence as the one lying on the floor. He wasn't looking at a random patrol or a scouting party. This was something else entirely. They saw, Don breathed. They didn't just see, Volka muttered. They felt it. Rourke clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The reports had been vague, the intelligence incomplete, but one thing had been made abundantly clear: no one had ever successfully engaged the Xendar in combat and lived to tell the tale. They weren't just a species. They were a hive, a single consciousness spread across countless bodies. What one experienced, all experienced. And he had just shot one of them. The clicking noise from the fallen Xendar's mandibles slowed, then stopped entirely. Its glowing eyes dulled, its body finally still. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the ship. The lights overhead flickered. Rourke turned sharply to Don. Tell me that wasn't the ship. Don swallowed hard, staring at the scanner's screen. They've locked onto us, sir. Another pulse rocked through the Peregrine asterisk. The deck beneath them vibrated, the hum growing in intensity. It wasn't weapons fire. The Xendar fleet wasn't attacking. They were waiting asterisk. The Xendar ships drifted into view, emerging from the darkness like living shadows. There were no energy surges, no weapons priming for an attack, just silent, eerie movement as the fleet surrounded the Peregrine asterisk. Captain Rourke stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears as he counted them. Dozens at first, then hundreds, then thousands. The entire void outside the viewport was shifting, filled with sleek, iridescent shapes reflecting the dim starlight. Lieutenant Don's fingers flew over the control panel, his voice tight. No active weapons signatures. No communications. Rourke's jaw tightened. Then what the hell are they doing? Don shook his head. I don't know, sir. But they're not here by accident. Chief Engineer Volka muttered a curse under her breath, her sharp eyes scanning the external sensors. That's an organized formation. Not a reaction force, not a random patrol. They were waiting for us. Rourke turned back to the viewport. The Xendar ships weren't identical, not in the way human vessels were constructed. They were organic-looking, their chitinous hulls pulsing slightly, shifting like breathing creatures. Some were massive, as large as dreadnoughts, their multi-limbed forms moving with slow, deliberate purpose. Others were smaller, agile, their movements erratic yet precise, as if responding to unseen commands in perfect synchrony. Don's voice came again, quieter this time. They knew. Rourke didn't respond. He didn't have to. The moment the Xendar soldier had died, the rest of the hive had known. The death hadn't just been witnessed, it had been felt asterisk. The intelligence reports had warned of this possibility, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of it. Every single Xendar in that fleet knew what had happened aboard the Peregrine asterisk. And yet, they weren't attacking. Rourke studied their movements, his gut twisting. The Xendar were unlike any enemy humanity had ever encountered. Their battles weren't fought like conventional wars. They didn't need warships bristling with weapons or fleets maneuvering into strategic positions. They simply moved, a collective intelligence flowing like a single organism, adapting, learning, waiting. Volka's hands were tight on the console. If they were going to fire, they'd have done it already. That doesn't mean we're safe, Don muttered. The ship's comms remained silent. No demands. No threats. The Xendar did not communicate the way humans did. Their language wasn't made of words, wasn't carried through radio signals or visual transmissions. It was something deeper, more primal. Rourke's fingers flexed at his side. If they had miscalculated, if they had assumed the Xendar operated on the same principles as any other species, then they were already at a disadvantage. The Peregrine's weapons systems were online, shields at full power, but against an enemy that moved with such unity, such overwhelming numbers, their technology suddenly felt insufficient. A low hum resonated through the ship, sending a ripple of unease through the crew. The vibration wasn't mechanical. It wasn't coming from the engines or the weapons systems. It was something external, something pressing against the hull in a way that made Rourke's skin crawl. Don's voice was barely above a whisper. "Captain, they're doing something." The Xendar ships weren't closing in. They weren't firing. But the void around them was shifting, warping, as if something unseen was altering the very space they occupied. The hum grew stronger, not a sound, but a sensation, a deep, crawling pressure that seemed to push against their thoughts, their nerves. Valka exhaled sharply. "They're waiting for us to react." Rourke clenched his jaw, his instincts screaming at him. To act. To do something asterisk. But that was exactly what the Xendar wanted. They weren't making the first move. They were waiting for him to. The Xendar's body convulsed one last time before it finally stilled. The strange iridescence of its exoskeleton faded, the once vibrant colors dimming as its segmented limbs sagged lifelessly against the floor. Captain Rourke exhaled slowly, his grip still tight on his weapon. Around him, the crew stood frozen, their faces pale with unease. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ship's systems and the faint, rhythmic clicking that still seemed to echo in the air, even though the creature was dead. Lieutenant Don swallowed hard. "Captain, something's happening." Rourke followed his gaze. The body was changing. The exoskeleton, once smooth and solid, was beginning to break apart. Tiny fissures spread across its surface, like cracks forming in a brittle shell. But there was no blood. No internal organs spilling out. Instead, the cracks deepened, and from within, something else emerged. A fine, shimmering dust lifted into the air, catching the dim light of the corridor. It wasn't dispersing randomly like ash or debris. It was moving with purpose, swirling in strange, fluid patterns that seemed intentional. Valka took a step back, her voice low and tense. "Containment protocols. Now." Don fumbled for his communicator. "Security team, we need an emergency quarantine in Section C." Before he could finish, the dust pulsed outward. A ripple of iridescent motes surged in all directions, flowing like smoke but moving far too deliberately. The fine particles slipped through vents, into the cracks of the floor, across consoles and interfaces. The very ship itself seemed to inhale them. Rourke's stomach twisted. "Seal the bulkheads." Valka's hands flew over the controls, but the system hesitated. The ship was responding sluggishly, as if something had already begun interfering with its operations. The motes, impossibly small, were vanishing into the very structure of the Peregrine, seeping into its circuits, its ventilation systems. "It's not just dispersing," Don muttered. He stopped short, eyes widening as his scanner began to flicker erratically. The readings were impossible to interpret, shifting and distorting. The particles weren't biological. They weren't mechanical. They were something else asterisk. The hum of the ship's systems changed. The usual rhythmic thrum of the engines and power conduits took on an irregular pulse, as though the ship itself was reacting. Valka cursed. "It's in the network." Rourke turned sharply to her. "What?" "The dust, those particles, it's not just floating around. It's integrating." She tapped furiously at the console, but the interface stuttered, flickered. "It's inside the ship's systems. It's hijacking something asterisk." Don's voice was barely above a whisper. "Captain, I don't think it's just getting inside the ship." He looked around, his face drawn and pale. "I think it's learning." The lights overhead flickered, and the ship shuddered, a slow, deliberate vibration that crawled through the deck beneath their feet. Rourke's pulse spiked. The Peregrine had no external damage. There were no impacts, no external forces acting upon them. But something inside was shifting, moving. A slow, crawling dread settled in Rourke's gut. The Xendar soldier hadn't just died. It had left something behind. And now, that something was inside their ship. The lights overhead pulsed erratically, casting jagged shadows across the corridor. Captain Rourke's breath came shallow as he gripped the edge of a console, watching in silent horror as the systems flickered. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable disruptions in power flow, slight delays in command responses, but now, the entire ship felt different. Alive asterisk. Lieutenant Don's hands flew over the interface, his brow slick with sweat. Captain, the ship's reacting to something. It's like, he hesitated, trying to find the right words. It's rewriting itself. Rourke clenched his jaw. He already knew the cause. The dust. The shimmering, intelligent motes that had emerged from the Xendar's corpse. The ship's filtration systems should have contained it, should have expelled any foreign contaminants, but the motes hadn't acted like a biological threat. They had moved with purpose, slipping into vents, sinking into the consoles, vanishing into the very structure of the ship. Chief Engineer Volka cursed under her breath as she slammed her fists against the control panel. We're losing systems. Core functions are still online, but it's like something's creeping through the data pathways. Peregrine isn't responding the way she should. Dawn turned sharply. You mean the ship's being hacked? Volka shook her head. Not hacked. Changed asterisk. The ship trembled again, a slow, deliberate vibration that seemed to move through the walls, through the floors, as though the very metal itself was being rewritten at a fundamental level. The air held a strange charge, a sensation just beneath the skin, like the moment before a lightning strike. Rourke's grip tightened. What's still under our control? Volka exhaled, running a rapid diagnostic. Engines are technically operational, but something's messing with their power distribution. Weapons are offline. Life support is still stable, but if this thing spreads, she trailed off, shaking her head. Dawn's face had gone pale. Sir. Rourke turned. The screens in front of them flickered. For a brief second, static crackled across the displays, then, symbols began appearing, strange organic patterns shifting too fast for human eyes to process. They weren't random. They weren't meaningless. The shapes pulsed, forming structures, reforming, dissolving, like a living language trying to take shape. Dawn's voice was hoarse. There inside the ship, Rourke could feel it too, a cold certainty settling into his bones. This wasn't just a system malfunction. The Peregrine wasn't simply being infiltrated, it was being repurposed asterisk. Then, the lights dimmed. The hum of the ship deepened, vibrating through the walls in a way that no human vessel should. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was almost, breathing asterisk. Volka took a slow, careful step back from the console. I don't like this. A whisper crawled through the comm system. Not a voice. Not words. A presence. The sound slithered through the ship's speakers, seeping into the air itself. It wasn't coming from any single location, it was everywhere, all at once. Then, the whisper changed. Became something else. Became words asterisk. You took one of us. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a single voice. It was layered, 1,000 shifting tones merging into something just barely comprehensible. It didn't speak through sound, it pressed the meaning into their minds, making their thoughts feel suddenly foreign asterisk. Dawn staggered back. Oh, hell. Rourke's fingers curled into fists. They're communicating. The whisper didn't stop. It expanded, filling the space around them. You killed one of us. Now we will take all of you. The ship's structure groaned, the metal vibrating like a living thing. The voice echoed through the ship, layered and shifting, pressing into their minds rather than simply passing through their ears. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a weight pressing down on them, seeping into their very thoughts. It was cold, emotionless, and absolute. You took one of us. Now we will take all of you. Captain Rourke's fingers curled into fists. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, even as the air around him felt thick and charged with something unnatural. The Peregrine was no longer entirely theirs. The Xendar weren't just watching from the void outside, they were inside, their intelligence flowing through the ship like a spreading infection. Lieutenant Dawn's face was pale, his hands trembling over the console as he tried to regain control. Sir, our systems, he swallowed hard, staring at the readouts. There, rewriting asterisk. Rourke stepped forward, gripping the edge of the console and looking over his shoulder at Chief Engineer Volka. Can you isolate them? Volka's jaw was tight, her fingers moving furiously across the interface. I don't even know what I'm isolating. This isn't just code. It's not a virus. She stopped abruptly as the screen flickered, the strange alien symbols flowing across it, shifting too fast for human eyes to track. It's them. They're thinking through the ship. Another pulse shuddered through the Peregrine, a slow and deliberate tremor. The lights dimmed to an eerie glow, the emergency indicators flickering in and out as if the ship itself was caught in an unnatural rhythm. The air had a hum to it now, not mechanical, not electrical, but something deeper, like the very fabric of the vessel was being repurposed. Dawn's voice was hoarse. "They're locking us in." Rourke turned sharply. "What?" Dawn's hands flew across the console, trying command after command, but the system refused to respond. "They've overridden the bulkheads. Internal doors, airlocks, everything's on lockdown." He shook his head, eyes darting over the failing interface. "They're not just trapping us. They're containing us." Volka let out a quiet curse. "We need to shut this down. Now." The whisper came again, slithering through the comms, surrounding them from every direction. "There is no shutting us down." Rourke's blood went cold. The displays shifted once more, the strange symbols dissolving and reforming into something new, something terrifyingly familiar. Their own ship schematics. The Peregrine's layout, flashing with movement indicators. But the highlighted sections weren't crew positions. They were Xendar-controlled systems *. The infection had spread. It was no longer just in the data pathways. The Xendar intelligence was moving, expanding, taking control of the ship's very framework. Dawn exhaled sharply. "They're inside the hardware." The whisper deepened, shifting into a resonance that pressed into their skulls, almost overwhelming. "You are part of us now." The walls shuddered. The lights flared. The deck beneath them vibrated like a pulse. The Peregrine was no longer just a ship. It was becoming something else *.